Alrighty, so we're back to Chirrut. I still think it's a good deck, so I decided let's do an update. For those of you who follow this channel, you know that I've been a big Chirrut fan. Kind of was the first major video I did. It was like a Chirrut deck guide, so right back at it. For anyone that still wants to play Chirrut, thought I'd give you a little update for some new people to the channel. This is a really cool and unique deck. And I think it's actually pretty competitive and is getting a little bit forgotten about. So before we get going, just want to thank everyone. You got me to 2,000 after that last video. We actually shot right past 2,000, so next stop's 3K, so please subscribe. Helps out a ton. All right, let's start. So why Chirrut? First of all, very unique, fun gameplay. It's a lot different than many decks. It at its core is a pretty aggressive tempo-y deck. It's not as quite as aggro as something like Sabine, but it does try to get under a lot of decks and poses some unique gameplay mechanics, especially revolving around Chirrut's kind of indestructibility. Additionally, I think it's a pretty it's got game into a lot of decks, so it doesn't have things I would call auto losses. There are bad matchups, but nothing that screams like unwinnable in a sense of you just have no chance, right? And then Force Throw. Force Throw is awesome. It's my favorite card, probably. I think it's so powerful and fun to use. And also Force Throw, as I said, it's really awesome. So I put it here twice. All right, let's get going. All right, so Chirrut versus Ray. This is in jest. My buddy Symbiote made all these images for me. I think it's kind of funny. I really like Chirrut. No hate on Ray. I think Ray is a pretty good deck, but we're going to focus on Chirrut. And the differences between them at its core are really the leader. Although the decks play a lot of similar cards, right? They play Force Synergy stuff. The package of units is often pretty similar, especially at the lower part of the curve. Chirrut is definitely the more aggressive of the two decks. His leader deploys quicker. It is kind of indestructible, which makes upgrading him pretty useful. It's not something Ray does. Ray's a bit slower, more board-centric ability, right? Her leader ability is definitely more powerful than Chirrut's, that buff ability, but it does also tend to toss priority away to your opponent. So it does end up being a more reactive deck. Her leader deploy is not an aggressive card. It's pretty weak statted. So again, it helps you control the board. Her heal, her built-in heal helps you kind of stall in that sense. So that's where I'd say they are different. Chirrut, more aggro. Ray, definitely more controlling. But there is a lot of overlap, right? They both will play a discard core to their deck right now. They both play Force Synergy, as I said. And a lot of the units also will just end up kind of being in both decks. All right, elephant in the room. Is it over? Is this pointless? Is this whole deck tech a waste of time because Rivals Fall exists? The answer is a pretty clear-cut no. Rivals Fall is kind of overrated in general, in my opinion. It's a good card. It'll be around. It'll be in some control decks for sure, whether main deck, sideboard. It does not spell the end for Chirrut. I actually think Chirrut's even better this set into control decks than he was in the previous set, right? I think the addition of Pillage really helped shore up its control matchups. Something like the red Chirrut deck from set 1 had a very specific anti-control deck that revolved around Force Surrender, K2, and Force Throw to kind of rip the hand to shreds. It is now a main deckable strategy because of Pillage being much more easily used than Force Surrender. And on top of that, I just don't think against these control decks, you have to go all in on upgrading Chirrut. Upgrades can go on other units. They can be used in many ways. The deck only plays 3 anyway, 3 Jedi Lightsabers. There are some other buffs like Wing Leader and Forces with Me, but those cards can go on, buffs can go on other units. Chirrut definitely pressures the opponent more. It makes them have to hold up things like Rivals Fall. So if they do that and use their whole turn on your 3/5, that's kind of okay. You got other units in play potentially. You can add further and go wider. I don't think Rivals Fall is some anti-Chirrut destroyer card. It'll be around. You'll have to be aware of it. You won't be able to just like all in on Chirrut sometimes, but I think there's a lot of workaround. All right, finally, sorry it took so long. Here's the list. It'll be in the link. There'll be a link to it in the description, so you don't need to like memorize this right now. I'll also be going through all the cards kind of bit by bit. Do keep in mind kind of globally, this deck as constructed right now is definitely weaker into aggro, especially like something like Sabine, than it was in set 1. I have moved to a more main deck discard plan, right? There's K2s now in the main deck. There's Pillage, right? For those of you who remember from the previous set, that K2 slot was a Sentinel. It was Baze Malbus. I think I did end up with like one K2 in the main deck. The Pillage slot was just more removal, like a third open fire. There were extra takedowns. There was another Obi-Wan. So the deck is definitely less geared main deck to handle Sabine. Additionally, Sabine has gotten buffed in that mid-range area with Poe and Wrecker, which also poses a little bit of a problem. So I would definitely say unfavored game 1 into that deck. I will talk about the sideboard later, but it does dedicate a lot of slots to that matchup, and it's mainly because I feel like the main deck configuration right now is much more suitable into the wide field at the expense of Sabine. So I'd rather shore that matchup with very specific cards that are not very good outside of playing against Sabine and use the main deck to kind of handle a bunch of other things. All right. So the early unit package looks almost identical to what it was in set 1. Now, the reason for this is, first of all, Restored Arc, A-Wing, and Sabine are still basically the best 2-drops you can play in Hero Blue aggro, right? I don't think Ketsu Onyo is particularly good because she has 2 health. I don't think Val is a good card at all, and I just haven't been able to find any reason to move away from the 9 2-drop Rebels. I play the 1 of R2 mainly because I think I want 10 available turn 1 plays just for math reasons. You can see breakdowns if you run them through like hypergeometric calculators, but it's where I feel most comfortable with this deck. And I choose R2 because it's a 1-drop that can fit into the curve more easily than some other 2-drops. Although I think that slot is purely a flex slot. It can be a ton of things. It can be a C-3PO. It can be the 2/3 Rebel Saboteur. And it could be Regional Governor. It could be a bunch of things. I just opt R2. It's another Rebel, so it works with a lot of our 3-drops. The rest of this early unit package, now there's one other, it's Yoda, but I talk about that a little separately in the Force stuff. It's still Fleet Lieutenant and Wing Leader because they buff all the Rebels, right? They're very strong follow-up plays. Wing Leader also doubles as a buff for Chirrut later on his flip turn because it's often really good to get him buffed on that turn. And finally, a new card in Cassian. Cassian's great. It fills a really important need here. So the 3-drop slot in set 1 was Fleet Lieutenant, Wing Leader, and Yoda. Now, Fleet Lieutenant and Wing Leader both required another Rebel in play to be useful. So Yoda was really the only one that you can play onto an empty board and not feel terrible about it. But now we've got another 3-drop that can fill that slot, right? So you play your A-Wing and it gets removed before you can follow up with a Fleet Lieutenant and Wing Leader. You can now have a unit that you can just not be embarrassed to jam out there, as opposed to like, oh, here's my naked Wing Leader, right? Cassian, additionally, his Smuggle is awesome. This is such a good card against control decks in attrition matchups. Not only does he come in ready, so he represents burst damage, he can also be geared up on that turn, right? Like, late in the game, if you're just trading resources, you play a card, they remove, you play a card, they remove. Having access to like burst damage where you can like play Cassian, equip him with a Jedi lightsaber and hit for 6 immediately, that could just end the game on the spot. So I love his Smuggle ability. It's where I really want to use him, right? I'll mostly resource him as long as I have a different option to play on turn 2. But it's just nice that he can double as a turn 2 curve filler as well as a late game buffer. Fleet Lieutenant, just a little call out here. It's great at maintaining initiative. That's kind of what the idea is with him early in the game, is to either maintain initiative or to use one of your 2-drops to kind of trade up on board. It's been a little less impressive in this in my playtesting in this set than it was in set 1, which is why he's down to 2 and Wing Leader's back up to 3. I think that ratio is actually reversed in set 1, so just a little note there. All right, the Force Core. So I briefly talked about Yoda. So it is one of the most important units in the game because it's a very clean turn 2 play, as well as our cheapest enabler for some of our power cards like Force Throw and Mystic Reflection and Forces with Me. So Force Throw is awesome. It costs 1. It often is a 2-for-1 because, you know, you can rip a card from their hand and dunk on something they have in play. Additionally, as most of you who have seen anything I've talked about with Force Throw, it has the backup plan of being able to toss your own units at your opponent's big stuff, right? You can throw a Luke at a Boba and one-shot it. You can throw an Obi-Wan or something at a Sabine and one-shot it, right? For 1 cost, it can be such a tempo swing in that mid-game that it's such a core card. It's probably the best card in this deck, so we love it. On top of that, it pairs really well with the rest of our discard package, which I'll talk about a bit later, but that's kind of a key component to this deck right now, is ripping your opponent's hands to shreds. Mystic Reflection is a new card. It's quite powerful, not quite on the power level of Force Throw, but again, it's 1 cost, so it squeezes into our curves really well, and that -2/-2 when you have a Force unit is great, right? It can kill 7 Fleet Defenders and TIE Phantoms for 1. That's really strong. It can help clean up units. It can help your trades be more effective, right? They play, I'll always use, Boba's a great example. They play a Boba, you can shrink it into a 2/5. You can now you can flip your Chirrut, Wing Leader the Chirrut can now kill that Boba and only take 2 damage back, and at the same time you also prevented 2 damage to your base because the Boba wasn't able to hit as much, right? The minus attack thing is actually pretty relevant, and it can be relevant even without a Force unit, right? Your space unit that would trade into their space unit maybe now lives because you can shrink the attack, right? Like A-Wing, they have a mercenary gunship or Kylo's tie or something, you can shrink it before you attack. With your A-Wing will survive. You also prevented that damage that they would have gotten to attack into base. All right, so Yoda's great. One of the best cards into aggressive matchups too because of this built-in restore and how early he comes on. He turns on all our Force stuff. He's great card advantage in attrition matchups, so he's core. I feel like Kanan is still core. I know a lot of people are not really impressed with him, but our deck revolves around Force synergies. He's just a beefy unit. He also has built-in heal, which is nice. He's a great carrier of something like Forces with Me. Becoming a 6/7 is really hard to deal with. And I just still think he fits here. He is also a rebel, so there's that with the Fleet Lieutenant and Wing Leader stuff. Jedi Lightsaber is the only actual upgrade we play in this deck. It's awesome on Chirrut, right? Chirrut turns into a 6/8 that also shrinks things. Makes him be able to one-shot almost every leader in the game. It's fantastic. You just have to be aware, right? Like, sometimes it's just not right to put it on Chirrut. Sometimes it's not right to really play it at all. If you're worried about a Rival's Fall as an immediate follow-up. If you are worried about like a Power of the Dark Side kind of thing, right? And you don't have anything to protect Chirrut, it might not be right to get it on him. But there's tons of matchups where it's fantastic. It can go on other units too. Like a turn 2 R2 wearing this in some matchups can really just decimate the board for a little while and force your opponent to deal with that, which is great. It's really good on Yoda as long as you're not expecting Traitorous. It has a lot of utility. It's a very core card in this deck. It is usually going on Chirrut, but don't tunnel into that. Forces with Me is another fantastic Force card, and don't forget it can be played not just as a Force card, right? It can be played on anything to give 2 experience and an automatic attack, which is really nice, right? That automatic attack helps maintain initiative in this deck, and this deck sometimes puts your opponent in positions where like they're 1 attack away from lethal, right? It often happens with something like Chirrut, who can come in. Let's say we're on turn 4, right? Chirrut's flipping. You get that lightsaber on him and you hit base for 6. And the follow-up action, the first thing you do is Forces with Me on Chirrut to hit base for 8. So that was 14 damage between those two attacks. If you had only done, I don't know, 3 damage to your opponent all game before that, that puts them at 17, and you have an 8 power Chirrut in play. If they're on a rare base, that's lethal. If they're not, then you would have had to deal 5 more damage that game to put them at 1 more action lethal. That action cheat kind of puts your opponent in check sometimes. It means they have to claim if they can't immediately answer the Chirrut or whatever else is doing the Forces with Me, or whatever else is in play that is representing lethal. And that's something really cool about that card. It's Fleet Lieutenant does it too, to an extent, right? At action cheats. It doesn't leave behind extra power though. But Forces with Me is awesome. But also the even better part here is you do it on the Force unit. That unit gets a shield and instantly bop something. You kill a unit, you leave behind a bigger unit, and you're off to the races. Obi-Wan I've included as a one-off. It's another thing I would consider a pretty flexible slot here. I still, right now, I'm opting one Obi-Wan just because he still has the Force thing. He still can, draw you a card sometimes if you get that buff onto a Force unit. I think you can try Mandalorian here or another whatever card. I mostly just wanted another chunky card. That's really why I ended up with Obi-Wan. I wanted something that cost 5 or more, that had some kind of immediate board impact. That number is also important just because it gives you another big unit to force throw onto something. Obi-Wan can get chucked at a Fett's Fire Spray to one-shot it. So it's why I opted for a 6-drop. And Sentinel is immediate board impact, so I landed there. But I think you can mess around with that slot. He is not a particularly impressive card, but he just fills a role. Luke, finally, not much to say here. Card's absolute bomb. We play it. It's not even that we play it because it's a Force unit. We play it because it's a bomb, and it just is a Force unit. It is a stabilizing force into a lot of matchups because of the Restore 3, something that anyone who plays Rey is familiar with being a powerful thing, right? If that card stays in play and is able to attack, you start trading 6 damage to your opponent plus 3 health to you. It's a 9-point swing. He comes in, he can remove things, including pesky shielded units, of which there are a bunch. So yeah, he's obviously core. Not much else to add there. All right, discard. So we'll talk about this here. So this is the discard package in the deck. It's 3 Force Throw, 2 K2, 3 Pillage. So Force Throw, we know how good it is outside of the fact that it's also ripping the hand to shreds. But the idea here behind Chirrut in a lot of matchups is that we can tax the hand so much that the opponent ends up with no cards left. Force Throw, K2, Pillage, it's a lot. It's a lot of discard, and usually if you can get about 4 cards out of your opponent's hand by turn 5 or so, you can put them into top deck mode. And that has become so much easier now with the addition of Pillage. Before, we needed to wait until 6 resources with Forced Surrender, and it would eat up our entire turn. Now it's quite powerful, and it even drew us some cards, but Pillage is just much cleaner. It can come online much earlier. Even on our Chirrut flip turn, it can pair with Force Throw to get 3 cards from our opponent's hand. If we K2'd the turn before, we can actually get 4 cards out of our opponent's hand on that turn. Most decks, if they've been resourcing and playing cards, are at 0 at that point. There's just nothing else they can do. And once you put your opponent in top deck mode against Chirrut, you can feel really good because it's much safer at that point to start gearing up Chirrut. And you can really just force your opponent to have to top deck some very specific cards in order to beat you. So this strategy has gotten much better. It's played better into Boba than I originally thought it would. Mainly, discard was not a particularly good strategy into Boba because Force Surrender was just way too slow into those decks. They were too aggressive for us. So when Force Surrender was not good, I didn't even like K2 in that matchup because K2 was a liability into something like a Bosk Ambush or even Boba being able to one-shot it. And since they were really the aggro deck, I didn't love playing a 4/4 on turn 3. So that's why we ended up with Baze as a Sentinel. But now that this discard plan is actually better, I like the K2s in the main deck because it's not actually that bad. With Boba in particular, they want to play their hand out. That's kind of the whole idea, is that they get extra resources with his ability. They end up playing more cards out, and then that discard hits them even harder. And that pillage, like getting the last 2 cards out of their hand, can be really good and make their leader ability not particularly impactful anymore, because they just don't have cards to spend the extra resources on. So yeah, this naturally plays well into control decks too. You can tax their hand. It is not a substitute for being aggressive. It's why I think Chirrut plays pretty well into controls, because you also just have that plethora of like rebel aggro synergy, as well as like the geared up Chirrut stuff, so you can push a lot of damage while attacking the hand. I think that part of it plays a little better than Ray, who is not quite as good at pushing damage through. Although this discard plan is sound, it is not an automatic win into control. They have plenty of cards that generate card advantage for themselves, which is why I like also shortening the game so that they can't like chain things that 2-for-1, right? Faders, overwhelming barrages, getting into Snokes, any card draw they may be playing in their deck. If they're playing like yellow, Enticing Reward is a big one, right? Because that's drawing them extra cards. Bounty Hunter Crew draws them a card. So you can't just rely on, oh, I'll draw a discard and I win. Like, it's not that simple. The discard stuff doesn't automatically make you favored into control, but paired with a clock, it does a very good job of and into them. All right, just the last few cards. So this is the interaction. In addition, like some of the other cards were interactive too, right? Like Force Throw, Mystic Reflection. These are the leftovers. We got a couple open fires. We still just like don't want to be dead in the water against hard aggro. Open fire is solid into Sabine. There's some other decks it does decently well into. It actually probably would play decently well into Ray, killing their units, especially before she can buff them. It would play decently well into Han, new Han, and probably old Han. And yeah, so it's there. Vigilance as well. It's one of the best cards into Sabine. The kill heal is awesome. It has some play in other matchups too, where people are playing like 7th Fleet Defender. So I think it's decent there. It has like wide application, but its primary and best role is into aggro. I was only able to fit 1 takedown. I don't love the card in general, but if I was going to play just like 1 random removal, it's between like this, Fell the Dragon, Rival's Fall. I still think takedown has the most widest application, and that's why I've opted for that. And Redemption is, I think, a pretty solid closer. It's a big unit. It's one of the better big units we can play in this color pair. I'll talk about Crate Dragon later. It makes an appearance in the sideboard. I think Redemption is really a nail in the coffin against Sabine, and you can often get to that point if you're able to like stall through the Vigilances. So if you're able to like drop that Redemption and heal 8, you can usually lock games up there. Additionally, it's another good force throw target in those situations where you need to target yourself to kill something big. So yeah, I like it. It's still a solid card. Hey, it's got Rebel too, so there's some times where that matters a tiny bit. All right, this is the current sideboard I have configured. This stuff can change drastically. There's not even like an established meta, so this is just kind of like a theory crafted sideboard. Like I said, I wanted a lot of this to be good into aggro, so I've thrown 3 Devotions in here. Devotion is a solid card into hard aggro. I've put the 3rd Open Fire in and the 3rd Vigilance. So that 5-card package is all coming in against like Sabine. Basically, the Devotions and Open Fire are only going to come in against Sabine. Like, there's not much else I want to do with either of those cards. Open Fire maybe in some other matchup that you've identified, it can get a clean kill. But yeah, the Disabling Fang Fighters, there are some more upgradey things going on. It's not a bad card even into into decks that aren't playing like a ton of upgrades. Like if you have something to cut in Boba Fett, you can just play the Fang Fighter because it now can like trade evenly with a 7th Fleet Defender. It's not embarrassing. It can rip off some experience counters from decks. It hits Traitorous, which I think we'll probably see a little bit of an uptick because it's quite good into the TIE Phantom decks. And it's actually probably pretty decent into Ray decks that are looking to buff their early units. So if we see more Traitorous, we might want to board these in and start baiting that Traitorous out. Like maybe we gear up a Yoda and then hope it gets Traitorous so we can really blow them out. So Fang Fighter has some wider applications. You know, there's dark sabers too. There's other people playing Jedi lightsaber or Fallen lightsaber. There's Boba's armor. There's just like things. I think it's a pretty good, though not great card, but it has a wide enough application that I think it warrants the slot. I put the third K2 here and the 2 Crate Dragons, and those are primarily coming in against Control. So we get that full package of K2s, and we've got the Crate Dragons to really try to like end the game. So we are aggressive. We should ideally be doing damage to your opponent, and then at certain points, Crate Dragon could just block them out from playing cards ever again. I think that's really the only place I would want the Crate right now. There might be some other fringy places, like potentially if you're playing Chirrut against Rey, those games might drag on for quite a while. So Crate Dragon could be decent there. It could be decent into like a Han Green in a really grinding matchup, although I think just the discard plan in general should be able to shorten that game substantially. All right, these are cards not in the deck. I didn't want to put a list of like 50 here. These are a few that I was like very much on the fence on right now. Didn't quite make it. Would not fault you for including them somewhere in the 60. It Binds All Things, I think, is still a pretty good card. I just couldn't really fit it right now. I preferred Mystic Reflection, but It Binds is nice. It's a cheap card. It's another thing that like works decently well with Chirrut because he's able to hold damage on him. So you can like bait him getting killed and then heal him, kill something else. So I think it's a solid card and it's worthy consideration. Make an opening, right? I really like this card, but Mystic Reflection is a much cheaper version of this, but there is a potential that you just want more of it. It does heal too, so in certain situations it might be pretty relevant. It has never been truly impressive against Sabine though, because it doesn't really cleanly answer any of their units. Where it was most beneficial was actually usually against Boba Fett, but it didn't make it for me. Concord Dawn is one that I've flip-flopped a ton with the Fleet Lieutenant slot, actually. What ended up putting it here and not in the deck was its 1 power. Like I said, I still think at our core we want to be aggressive. I don't love this card to do anything other than like try to delay our opponent a little bit. Our opponent is not going to suicide A-Wings into this, so essentially this just sits there and stalls their board until they're able to kind of like deal with it cleanly, either maybe with like a red 3 and then the A-Wing cleans it up, or if they end up with any kind of other way to get rid of it. So it's nice. I think it would be decent into Sabine. Not much else other than maybe these like really hard space decks that are playing like Dark Grade and going pure space. It's not an embarrassing card. I think it like really almost made the list. It was probably the closest card to making the list out of these. Up until right at the end, it was in that Fleet Lieutenant slot. So definitely look at it. Tech would be just like a one of. I think for like grindy games, I think a lot of hero decks can consider just including him as a one of. So yeah, consider that. And Baze. So we talked about Baze a little bit in that 4-drop slot. It would still be a better choice into Sabine than K2, right? We're never playing K2 into Sabine. It's not good there. But I wanted that main deck configuration, like I said, to be good into the wide field. Baze is not particularly good into the wide field. He's good against Sabine. He's decent into Boba. But now that we've identified a discard with Pillage and K2 is also decent into Boba, he matters less there. So he's not in it, but if you want to be better into aggro, I think you should look at him. You could also look at the 2/6 Sentinel, Nima, something. Would also be like an interesting card in that slot. And lastly, Mandalorian. I don't know if he's better than Obi-Wan. He might be. He can't get cunninged, which is pretty big, like bounced, because he has 5 power, not 4. So against like mono yellow, he would definitely be better than Obi-Wan. The 2 shields on a cheap unit is nice, but I don't know how impactful that'll end up being. I think the 2 experience is probably more impactful, even if the unit is not a force unit. The 2 experience from that Obi-Wan death trigger has been a little better, I think, but I think they're close, and I could be wrong, and Mando might just be worth that slot over Obi-Wan. All right, so now some stuff on strategy. So the Chirrut deploy is the big thing, right? This is a major flip turn, and it's supposed to help you really catch up in games that you were behind, or really torpedo forward in games that you were already ahead. Chirrut is a cheap deploy at 5. He's a very safe deploy into most decks because, again, he doesn't die to lethal damage. So the stuff that does one-shot him is things like Takedown, Power of the Dark Side if he's the only unit in play, or Rival's Fall, but that's at 6 resources, right? So it doesn't always line up that way. So in a lot of places, he's a clean deploy. In places that he's not, you can, like, against a takedown deck, you're really not supposed to deploy him just into that takedown. You can usually churn some other actions, play some other units, force your opponent to actually commit resources before you deploy him, right? If your opponent's just sitting there, pass, I'm holding up a bunch of resources, I obviously have takedown in my hand, well, play Kanan. Ask your opponent what they're going to do then, right? Like, play a K2. If they're still going to pass, then you can just claim without deploying, and they've just wasted an entire turn. In the most cases, they can't do that, especially because you are an aggressive deck, and likely they need to answer a unit you played the previous turn also, right? On the 4 resource turn, you might have played a 4 drop. On the 3 resource turn, you probably played a 3 drop. It's not like they can just sit there, take damage, and hold a bunch of resources to answer the Chirrut flip. I've never really had that much of an issue flipping Chirrut. It can happen if you get completely gummed up early and your opponent just had like a perfect curve out answer to every threat you played, or if you just like had to skip a turn. Yeah, like you can lose some games, certainly, but it hasn't been too much of an issue getting him deployed and getting him geared up if needed. The best upgrades are the 3 at the bottom there: the Wing Leader, Jedi Lightsaber, Forces with Me. So Jedi Lightsaber is the most powerful one. It makes Chirrut into a 6/8. It also makes him one-shot a ton of things, like Boba Leader gets one-shot and only deals 2 damage back to him. He also just, hits for 6, so you can start racing opponents in certain game states. Wing Leader is the cleanest into a Power of the Dark Side deck because it buffs the Chirrut while also putting a disposable unit into play. And Forces with Me is really nice, especially when our unit can kill something. Like if Chirrut can kill something with 5 power, that's great. The other option is you deploy Chirrut and you can Force with Me something else that isn't Chirrut. And that widens our threat base, right? You can like Force with Me an A-Wing or something. Now that A-Wing is a 3/5 in space, it hits for 5. Now do they answer A-Wing? Do they answer Chirrut? It's not always, like I said, correct to put it all in on Chirrut. Now, it's the cleanest, and it works into a lot of matchups. Like, not every matchup has clean, like, removal that directly interacts with Chirrut. A lot of them do have to interact with him with combat damage, and in that case, yes, buffing him is usually right. So those are the 3 buffs. The 2 of the cards are our supplement cards, Force Throw being an incredibly powerful card that squeezes into this turn very cleanly, like that plus Forces with Me, that plus Jedi Lightsaber, that plus K2 or Kanan, right? Like, it doesn't have to be a buff. It's not always correct to use the buff, but Force Throw is almost always correct to play when you can and have like a clean thing to target. Don't forget, we also have Tarkin Town, so even if they discard a weak card, we're often able to clean up whatever we do damage to with the Tarkin Town. Mystic Reflection is another card that can squeeze into this curve really nicely. It helps when we have other units to finish off things, especially when that unit that we were Mystic Reflection does not have 2 health, right? If we need to just shrink it first and then defeat it with another unit, Mystic Reflection is great. Sometimes we can even do like a Force Throw, Mystic Reflection, and Jedi Lightsaber. It's an absolutely obscene turn, potentially. And the Force Throw in particular works really well if the previous turn we had a K2 in play, because we can, bam, get a double discard. Or, Force Throw plus Pillage. I talked about that earlier. Forget the buffs for a moment. If you're just able to get the last 3 cards out of their hand on the Chirrut flip turn, you're going to feel really good about that. All right, the leader ability. So this gets a lot of hate, and it's not a very good leader ability. I'm never going to tell you it's a good leader ability, but we have it, and we need to know what to do with it and like how to utilize it to the best of its ability. Primarily, it's to action pass, right? It's a free way to give your opponent priority to make them commit to something. So we do it on some random unit, and then bam, they have to do something, right? If they pass, we can claim, so they're at risk for that happening. And otherwise, they have to play something, and we get to respond to that. And that's the main use for that ability, just that free pass of an action. Some other neat things it can do is protect the unit from removal. So you have something in play that's would be in range of like open fire or takedown or something. You can buff it prematurely so that they now can't remove it, and you'll still like, or they can try to, but the unit won't die until the end of the turn. Like in the case of open fire, they can still put the 4 damage into something, but you'll still be able to use the unit, and you'll be able to use it after seeing what your opponent did, right? So again, it connects to the action pass thing, but it's nice to just be able to get more information. A neat thing with the removal thing that I like to do, and this goes in tandem with like the potential buff stuff, is you worry sometimes about wing leadering something because your opponent might immediately be able to answer that unit, and that 2 experience will get wasted. So you can buff the unit's health before you do the wing leader and wait to see what they do. If they remove the unit through that buff, you at least haven't committed your wing leader and you feel okay. You do lose a little bit of damage from not attacking first, but hey, you haven't basically gotten 2 for 1. That can happen. Let's say one example will be like an A-wing, right? They're a takedown deck. You don't want to just like wing leader and get takedowned, so you buff the A-wing's health. Do they take down the A-wing? They might, but that's a 4 resource for 2 resource trade. You feel decent about that, and then you can go commit to a different plan. But if they don't, you can now buff the A-wing. It now has 7 health for the turn. They can no longer take down that A-wing, and you're able to push damage. And they'll have to like first action take down that A-wing next turn, which is fine for us because now we can deploy cleanly, and our opponent is exhausted a lot of their resources. And that's a lot of what you want to do. Another cute thing to do with it is, against Sabine, for instance, you have a Yoda in play. Now, Yoda is a very important unit into them, but is very susceptible to getting ambushed by K2. So often what we do on turn 2 is play a Yoda and then immediately take initiative. And as the first action of our follow turn, there's a few things we can do. We want to use the Yoda, right? We want to heal. We've likely taken damage. But if we attack with Yoda, if we don't have anything important to attack in the ground, it feels sometimes like a waste. What we would love to do is wait and see what to do with Yoda. Like, oh, are they going to play a unit? They're probably going to play Sabine at some point. Getting 2 damage into her is really nice. So we want to try to stall and not have to commit our Yoda's attack so early. But if we just sit there and play a different card, well, bam, now K2 can come in, ambush the Yoda, and we lost our chance. We didn't even get our attack off or our restore 2. So first action, give him 2 health. Against Sabine, there is nothing that they can do now to kill that Yoda in one shot. They can still ambush with K2. It still will put 4 damage into Yoda, but it wouldn't be a great play anymore because now Yoda can immediately swing back into that K2 and finish it off, and netting the 2 health. So it's a play I like to make there. It then keeps a force unit in play for the duration of that turn. So if we have something like Forces with Me, Force Throw, Mystic Reflection, all of those will be playable because of that Yoda. And these are thoughts you can extrapolate and like apply to a lot of other board situations. That 2 health can sometimes just give you more time to think about what you want to do with that unit. You may later in the turn just buff it because it took damage, which would have been lethal. That 2 health kept it around, and then you can end of the turn wing leader it, end of the turn Jedi lightsaber it, or Forces with Me. It might not get full value from any of those cards, but if it keeps that unit in play, it might be worth it. So just look at little edges you can gain from it. It is not a particularly impressive ability, but it has some uses. All right, I wanted to highlight this one matchup, just talk about it a little bit. Covered it a lot. The discard is really important. I've identified 4 as a kind of magic number, as long as your opponent is not drawing extra cards. Usually if you can get 4 cards by like that turn 5, you can put them into top deck mode, and that has become much easier now with Pillage instead of Forced Surrender. It happens earlier in the game, and for less resource investment. So K2, Pillage, Force Throw are all fantastic. K2, it's also an aggressive card. It's not always the case that you want to use him for discard. If you're aggroing him out, he does 3 damage to your opponent when he dies. Force Throw, again, control decks, no matter how unit light they are, still play units, and Force Throw is still good at killing units. So yeah, that's the core plan here, is that we're supplementing our aggression, and going wide is really important because their removal tends to be more expensive than our go wide units, right? We had that early list of the early units, right? We've got 9 2-drops and a 1-drop. We've got the 5 rebel buffers with Wing Leader and Fleet Lieutenant. We've got the Cassians. We've got Yodas. These are all cheap units that help you go wide. Even Kanan and K2 are not overly expensive. And almost none of these units die to removal that is more expensive, that is less expensive than they are. So being able to deploy like 2 units for the cost of 1 opponent removal is great. The only thing that this is weak into is Super Laser Blast, right? That's how they catch up. That and Overwhelming Barrage, but Overwhelming Barrage is also good at killing big things, so you can't really play around that Overwhelming Barrage specifically like that. There's other ways to play around that, and that's like with shields, like Forces with me, going tall on 1 unit. Chirrut plays around Overwhelming Barrage pretty decently himself because he can absorb the damage. But Super Laser Blast comes on so late, and that's where our discard plan is most effective. Additionally, we have things like Cassian as a follow-up into a Super Laser Blast. They can blast. You can like Cassian plus another unit sometimes and immediately get more aggression into play, and the opponent's board will be empty and the resources will be tapped out. So there are workarounds into Super Laser Blast, and yeah, don't just rely on the discard. You've gotta, I would ideally, if possible, deploy before discard. Like, you want that discard to follow up a board state where you already have units in play. I mentioned before, you don't only have to buff Chirrut. It's doubly true now that Rivals Fall exists. You just don't want to just like tunnel vision into that plan. The buffs, you should think of them sometimes as direct damage, right? I mentioned that you can just like play the Jedi Lightsaber and make it deal 3 damage to your opponent that turn and force them to immediately respond to that. Like 3 for 3 damage is something you do sometimes when you want to be aggro. Other than that, one little tip: if you're gotten into that top deck mode, and your opponent has no cards in hand, right? They do something, right? They play their last card. It's removal for something you have in play, but you still have something else in play, no matter how big it is. Let's say it's a Kanan, right? But you have a Pillage in hand. I would recommend just claiming there, and then top of your turn, you pillage your opponent's hand, right? They're drawing 2. You can get both of those cards out of your hand. You get a free reign for the rest of their turn to attack with whatever you have, to deploy whatever you have. It's a really big power play to be able to just pillage and deploy and just have like a free turn where your opponent does absolutely nothing. So look for those opportunities because they do present themselves sometimes with this deck. All right, lastly, yeah, don't be too scared. Rivals Fall, Takedown, Disabling Fang Fighter for your upgrades, right? Like, whatever. You can get over it. All right, so that's my Chirrut update for set 2. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you still like Chirrut. I still like Chirrut. I'm not saying right now it's what I would play in, like, the next 1K that I would have, or, like, Gen Con that's coming up. I think it still has some weaknesses. It's not the best deck. I think it's quite competitive. I think you'll have a lot of fun with it, right? I don't push decks that I think are bad, but I also will tell you straight up if I don't think it's the best deck, and I don't think it's the best deck. I think there are better choices if your goal is purely to spike a giant tournament, but that's not everyone's goal. And, even me, like, I'll take this sometimes to a tournament, like, or a local, right? Like, I don't think every time I play, it has to be the deck that I think is the absolute #1 deck. And Chirrut falls into a competitive tier, and I think he's worthy of continued playtesting. I think there'll be a time maybe later that once we have identified what the meta is, where we can hone this deck even more, and he might become even more competitive. And certainly I think the next set is anticipated to have more force cards based on the era that was talked about. So I could see him definitely getting upgrades in the future. But yeah, let me know what you think of Chirrut in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And until next time, take care.